Baghdad, 1979. A man stands up during a Ba'ath Party meeting. His hands tremble as he reads a list of names. Behind him, Saddam Hussein smokes a cigar, impassive, one by one. The men whose names are called are led away by guards. They will never return. This is the beginning of a new era in Iraq, where one man alone decided who should live and who should die. But how does one reach such a level of absolute power?
The story of Saddam Hussein is the story of how a child born in a mud hut managed to build one of the most oppressive personality cults in modern history. But to understand the dictator, we must first know the child. Born in Tikrit in 1937, young Saddam never knew his father, who died before his birth. His mother Saba remarried a man named Hassan al-Ibrahim, who proved to be a violent and sadistic stepfather. Witnesses from that time tell us that little Saddam was regularly beaten and humiliated, forced to live more like a servant than a son. The house where they lived was little more than a mud hut on the banks of the Tigris, and often the child had to steal to eat. It was during this period that young Saddam developed what psychologists would call a compensatory personality, an obsessive desire for power born from total childhood powerlessness. His schoolmates remember him as a quiet boy, with sudden bursts of anger, especially against those who mocked him for his poverty. Even then, he showed signs of what would become his distinguishing characteristic, a photographic memory for offenses received and infinite patience in planning revenge. The turning point in his life came thanks to his uncle Khairallah Tulfah, a former army officer with strong nationalist ideals. Tulfah was not just a military man, but also a fervent supporter of Pan-Arabism and an admirer of Hitler, of whom he owned a translated copy of Mein Kampf. It was he who introduced young Saddam to politics, teaching him that power was the only guarantee of survival. He also taught him the importance of violence as a political tool and the value of tribal loyalty. All lessons that the future dictator would apply with ruthless efficiency. Under his uncle's influence, young Saddam began to transform. He learned to read and write, developed an interest in history, especially that of the ancient Mesopotamian empires, and most importantly, began to see himself no longer as a victim, but as a potential leader. At just 20 years old, he participated in his first political assassination attempt, a failed attack on Prime Minister Abdul al-Karim Qasim. This episode, which forced him into exile in Egypt, later became part of his personal mythology, transformed by propaganda into proof of his youthful courage. When Saddam took power in 1979, his first concern was not foreign policy or the economy, but the methodical construction of his own image. The regime began a propaganda campaign unprecedented in the modern history of the Middle East. Iraqi media were completely enslaved to creating the myth of Saddam. Every newspaper had to publish his photo on the front page. State television constantly broadcast his public appearances, but the real peculiarity was the variety of roles in which he presented himself to the public. One day, he would appear in military uniform, inspecting troops with the stern gaze of a supreme commander. The next day, he could be seen in an elegant suit discussing literature in the National Library,
presenting himself as a refined intellectual. On other occasions, he wore traditional clothing and had himself filmed talking with farmers in the fields, playing the role of a leader close to the people. But there was an even more disturbing aspect of this personality cult: the systematic use of body doubles. Saddam's paranoia about his own security led him to create an intricate system of doubles, subjected to plastic surgery to perfectly resemble him. According to Western intelligence sources, Saddam maintained at least 7 active doubles simultaneously. The selection process was brutally efficient. Secret Service agents scoured Iraq looking for men with physical characteristics similar to those of the dictator. Once identified, these individuals were taken from their homes and subjected to a transformation program that could last years. The preparation of a double was a meticulous process. First came plastic surgery, then months of training to learn to imitate his characteristic gestures, the way he smoked cigars, his slightly swaying gait, even his peculiar laugh. The doubles also had to learn the specific accent of Tikrit and study the dictator's favorite topics. But the system also created paradoxical situations. It is said that one of the doubles, after years of playing the role, had developed such identification with Saddam that he began giving orders to generals. He was made to disappear immediately. Another double was executed because during a public appearance he had used his left hand to gesture while Saddam was right-handed. The use of doubles reached its peak during the Gulf War, when Saddam used up to 3 doubles simultaneously in different locations in Baghdad to confuse enemy intelligence services. This strategy proved effective. Several targeted attacks by the coalition hit locations where doubles were present, while the real Saddam moved continuously between different hideouts. Perhaps the most megalomaniacal aspect of Saddam's cult was his attempt to directly connect himself to the great kings of ancient Mesopotamia. He wasn't content with being the president of modern Iraq. He wanted to be seen as the direct heir of Nebuchadnezzar and Hammurabi. This obsession with ancient history wasn't accidental. It represented an attempt to legitimize his power by connecting it to a glorious past that preceded both Islam and the Arabization of Iraq. This delusion of grandeur manifested in the reconstruction of the ancient city of Babylon, a project that cost billions of dollars while the country suffered under international sanctions. Archaeologists were horrified when they saw that Saddam had built his personal palace right on top of the ancient ruins. Every brick of the reconstruction bore 2 names, that of the ancient Babylonian king and that of Saddam Hussein. "I am Nebuchadnezzar reincarnated," he once declared during an inauguration ceremony. His architects were forced to build palaces that mixed elements of ancient Mesopotamia with the most unbridled kitsch. The Palace of Babylon contained frescoes showing Saddam receiving divine powers directly from Sumerian gods. In another hall, a huge mural portrayed him alongside Alexander the Great, suggesting historical continuity between the great conquerors of the past and himself. But the obsession with Babylon didn't stop there. Saddam commissioned a series of historical studies that proved how his family descended directly from Sumerian kings. He also had commemorative coins minted showing his profile alongside that of Nebuchadnezzar. Teachers in schools were forced to teach this revisionist version of history, where Saddam emerged as the natural culmination of 5,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. The most ambitious project was the Babylon Festival, a grandiose theatrical celebration held annually in the restored ruins. During these events, actors in historical costumes recreated scenes from ancient Mesopotamia, culminating with the appearance of Saddam himself, presented as the modern incarnation of all the great kings of the past. All this while, the Iraqi population struggled to survive under the weight of international sanction.
The personality cult wasn't limited to propaganda, it permeated every aspect of Iraqi society. Control began from childhood. In schools, children learned to read from books containing poems dedicated to the father of the nation. The first word many of them learned to write was Saddam. Every morning, they had to sing songs celebrating the leader and recite an oath of allegiance before his portrait. In public offices, employees began the day with mandatory study sessions of the leader's thought. These meetings, called illumination circles, were actually indoctrination sessions, where participants had to demonstrate their enthusiasm. Those who showed little zeal risked being reported as lukewarm supporters of the regime. But behind this facade of adoration lay a system of total control. Saddam had created a network of informants so extensive that it's estimated 1 in 4 Iraqis was somehow connected to the security services. In residential neighborhoods, every block had its supervisor, formerly a Ba'ath Party representative, but actually a spy who monitored several families. The regime had perfected the art of selective terror. Not everyone was punished, but no one could ever feel safe. Disappearances often occurred at night. A security squad would pick up someone and the family would never receive explanations. Sometimes, weeks later, a phone call would arrive asking them to collect the relative's personal effects. Other times, there was total silence. The paranoia was such that many Iraqis developed a sort of double personality. One public, enthusiastically supporting the regime, and one private, hidden even from closest relative. This psychological split became a characteristic trait of Iraqi society. So much so that psychologists coined the term Baghdad syndrome to describe the collective trauma caused by decades of life under constant surveillance. In December 2003, when American troops found him hiding in a hole in the ground near Tikrit, Saddam Hussein was no longer the god king he had claimed to be for decades. He had returned to being what he had always been, a man alone, consumed by his own paranoia. His personality cult, built over 30 years of absolute power, crumbled in a few days. His gigantic portraits were torn down, his palaces looted, his statues dragged through the mud. What remained was only the bitter lesson of his trajectory. Absolute power corrupts, absolutely, transforming a man into a monster and an entire country into his personal prison. Today, only faded fragments of his portraits remain on the walls of Baghdad. But the true legacy of Saddam Hussein is not the rubble of his monuments, but rather the invisible scars left in the psyche of a people who for 30 years were forced to live in the cult of a false god.